Claudette Rivers walked onto the Family Feud stage as a contestant in 2018 and walked off as a woman who had just seen her husband, the man she believed had died in a construction accident 11 years earlier, standing in the front row of the audience. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She stood completely still at her podium and said, in a voice that barely carried across the stage, "Marcus." The studio fell completely silent. 300 people stopped breathing at the same moment. Steve Harvey turned toward the audience and then turned back toward Claudette, and in 30 years of television, he later said, he had never once experienced anything like what happened in the next 60 seconds. It was a Saturday taping in March 2018 at Trilith Studios in Atlanta. The Rivers family from Charlotte, North Carolina had arrived that morning in a rented minivan. Claudette, her 2 daughters Jasmine and Priya, her brother-in-law Dion, and her nephew Calvin. They were warm, funny, and nervous in the way most families are nervous before the cameras come on. Claudette was 44 years old with the kind of easy laugh that makes everyone around her feel welcome. She taught 3rd grade in Charlotte. She coached youth soccer on Saturdays. She had been raising her daughters alone for 11 years. She had applied to Family Feud because Jasmine, her older daughter, had been asking for years. "Mom, we should go on that show. You're good at everything." Claudette had finally said yes because she was turning 44. And she had made herself a promise. Stop saying no to the things that make your kids happy. Nobody in that studio knew that Claudette Rivers had carried a different kind of grief for 11 years, and that it was about to walk through a door. In 2007, Claudette's husband Marcus had been working as a site supervisor for a construction company in Raleigh. On the morning of November 14th, there was an accident on the 3rd floor of a building under construction. A section of scaffolding collapsed. 3 workers were injured. 1 worker was unaccounted for. Marcus Rivers was listed as missing. After an 8-day search, the county closed the investigation and issued a presumptive death certificate. The company sent a letter. The county sent paperwork. Claudette signed what she was told to sign. She was 29 weeks pregnant with Priya. She raised Jasmine and Priya alone. She told them their father had been a good man who loved them before they were old enough to remember him. Jasmine grew up asking questions. Priya grew up asking different ones. Claudette answered what she could and said, "I don't know," when she didn't. She never looked for Marcus. She had been told he was gone, and grief had done what grief does. It had slowly, painfully rearranged the furniture of her life until living without him was simply what living was. But Marcus Rivers was not dead. The scaffolding collapse had thrown him from the 3rd floor. He had survived with a fractured skull, 2 broken ribs, and a traumatic brain injury that had kept him in a state of confusion for the better part of 3 months. He had been taken to a hospital in Raleigh under an incorrect name, a clerical error made in the chaos of the scene. By the time Marcus could speak clearly enough to identify himself, his family had already received the paperwork. The hospital had tried to contact the construction company. The construction company, facing multiple lawsuits related to the accident, had failed to pass the information to the family. Marcus spent a year in rehabilitation. When he came home to what had been their house, now empty, he found that Claudette had moved away, no forwarding address in the system that matched. He searched for her for 8 years. He found a third-grade teacher named Claudette Rivers in Charlotte through a school newsletter published online. He drove to Charlotte. He knocked on her door. Nobody answered. What he didn't know was that the family was in Atlanta for a television taping. Marcus had seen the family Feud application in Claudette's recycling bin when he'd peered through her front window. He had found the production company's address through public records. He had gotten himself a standby audience ticket, and he had been sitting in the front row of Studio 29 for 2 hours, heart hammering, not knowing if this was real or if his brain was playing tricks on him the way it sometimes still did, waiting for his wife to walk through those doors. And then the retention hook that had been building for 11 years arrived without warning. Claudette saw him during the second commercial break. She had turned toward the audience to wave at Dion, and Marcus was sitting 4 feet from the stage barrier, leaning forward, and their eyes locked. She said his name. Just his name. The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey turned toward the audience and then back toward Claudette, and what he saw on her face told him everything he needed to know about what was happening. He set down his cards. He walked to the stage barrier. He looked at Marcus. He looked back at Claudette. "Hold on," he said quietly. "Hold on." He held up his hand to the producers. "This has never happened in the 45-year history of this show," Steve said. His voice was low and even, "and I am going to need everybody to just wait." He walked to the edge of the stage and he reached down and he helped Marcus Rivers up. Marcus climbed up those 4 steps and stood on the stage for the first time. Claudette had not moved from her podium. She was standing with her hands pressed flat on the surface, as if she needed something solid beneath her. Marcus walked toward her. He stopped 3 feet away. "Claudette," he said. She said, "I thought you were gone." "I know. I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Steve Harvey had to turn away from the cameras. His shoulders moved. He pressed his handkerchief to his face and stood with his back to the audience for a full 10 seconds. Even the crew members had stopped what they were doing. Hardened television professionals were looking at the floor. When Steve turned back around, his eyes were red. "I have been doing this show for 14 years, he said. "And I have seen things on this stage that I could not have written in a script. But I have never." He stopped. He started again, "Because 9 years ago I got a phone call from my daughter that I had missed 17 years of her life, and I had to figure out what that meant. And I thought I understood loss. I thought I understood what it cost." He looked at Claudette and Marcus standing 3 feet apart. "And watching you two right now, I realize I don't understand half of it." But Steve wasn't done. He called the stage manager over and told him to bring Jasmine and Priya down from backstage. Both girls had been watching on the monitor. Jasmine was crying. Priya, who was 11 years old and had never seen her father's face except in photographs, walked to the edge of the stage and stood absolutely still. Marcus Rivers looked at his daughter for the first time. Priya said, "Are you my dad? For real?" The room held its breath. "For real," Marcus said. He walked to her and he crouched down so that he was at her eye level, and she put her hand on his face, and Steve Harvey sat down on the steps of the stage and did not try to compose himself anymore. He made a phone call on live television to his foundation director. He arranged full family therapy and legal support for Claudette and Marcus to begin the process of rebuilding what had been broken. He covered the hotel, the travel, and 6 months of family counseling, right there on camera. And when the competing family, the Garcias from Miami, crossed the stage without being asked and hugged Claudette, the entire audience came to their feet. Both families received the full prize. Steve announced it without fanfare as a footnote, because the prize was already irrelevant. When the episode aired 4 weeks later, the clip of Priya saying, "Are you my dad, for real?" was viewed 420 million times in 18 days. It trended in every English-speaking country on Earth. It was covered by every major network. Commentators who had spent years being cynical about reality television wrote pieces they could not quite explain. 3 months later, Marcus and Claudette Rivers filed to have Marcus's presumptive death certificate legally vacated. Their attorney handled it at no charge. 6 months after the taping, on a Saturday morning in Charlotte, North Carolina, Claudette and Marcus were remarried in a small ceremony in Claudette's backyard. Jasmine took the photographs. Priya threw the flower petals. A year after the taping, they started the For Real Foundation, named after Priya's 4 words, dedicated to reuniting families separated by administrative error and institutional failure. In its first 2 years, the foundation worked with 38 families across the country. Every single one of them found at least a part of what they were looking for. Today, the Rivers family lives in Charlotte. Priya plays soccer on Saturdays. Sometimes Marcus coaches the other team so they can be on the same field. Some stories don't end. They simply become something else. Something larger and quieter and more permanent than the moment that started them. Claudette Rivers walked onto a game show stage to make her daughter happy. She walked off with her whole life changed. And somewhere in the audience of that studio, a man had been waiting 11 years for 60 seconds that would change his too. If this incredible story touched your heart, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Share this with someone who believes it is never too late to find your family or your way home. Have you ever been reunited with someone you thought was gone forever? Share your story in the comments. Because as Claudette and Marcus proved, some doors stay open even when we think they've been closed.